good news from the World Health Organization about new Ebola cases in West Africa. Election 2014 fallout. How Republican control of Congress could change Barack Obama's foreign policy. And 1989 is the platinum number for pop star Taylor Swift. Africa 54 starts right now.
Hello, I'm Lina Ormoudou. Vincent McCurry is on assignment. This is Africa 54. Today on Africa 54, the World Health Organization says the number of new Ebola infections in West Africa is about the same as it was the week before, with a rise in some areas and a decline in others. U.S. President Barack Obama on Wednesday asked Congress for more than $6 billion to combat the deadly virus at its source. VOA's Latika Hoke reports.
Reports from Sierra Leone say the number of new Ebola cases has risen drastically in the past weeks. Justin Forsythe, head of the Save the Children Fund, says many of his staff have lost family members in the vicious outbreak.
I met one of our education advisors that lost 14 members of his family. So they're dealing with a huge amount of pressure and anxiety. They're heroes in this struggle against Ebola. And the international staff who are coming in to support this, nurses and doctors and logisticians and health advisors.
Those who are burying Ebola victims are as much in danger as those who care for Ebola patients, so they have to wear elaborate protective gear.
Within Sierra Leone, there's a really elaborate burial rites, and that includes washing by hand a deceased person, and also at the funeral touching the body. So you've gone from a stage of having very elaborate ceremony. Then in this case, you've got people who are deceased and that they're taken from their family by people dressed from head to toe in plastic suits. They're indistinguishable, and it's a very scary situation.
In Liberia, the frightening spread of Ebola seems to be slowing down as the number of new cases has not grown. International aid providers say they are taking great care to prevent the spread of the virus.
We have to run a very strict no-contact policy, which means that in any zone where they're distributing the site that they've chosen, they will establish what they will call the safe area. So they will make the line of people around, and so that while we distribute straight out the back of a truck, so that nothing that people have touched, people are obliged to take, and vice versa.
The international community is responding to calls for more help to the affected region. The Dutch Navy is sending one of its biggest ships, Carol Doorman, with an entire hospital in a container. On the way to Africa, it will pick up additional aid from other European Union members. Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott announced his country's contribution on Wednesday.
We will commit up to $20 million to staff an Ebola treatment centre, a 100-bed Ebola treatment centre in Sierra Leone. This will be a centre that's being built by the United Kingdom, but it will be staffed by Australia.
U.S. President Barack Obama on Wednesday asked Congress to approve $6.18 billion in new emergency Ebola funds to West Africa and to prevent its spread outside the continent. Latika Hoke, VOA News, Washington.
In North Africa, a bomb attack near Egypt's presidential palace in Cairo has wounded one person early Thursday in the latest of a deadly trio of attacks in and around the capital overnight. The worst explosion was on a train late Wednesday north of Cairo that killed 2 police officers and a civilian. At least 11 others were wounded. A third blast at a metro station in eastern Cairo wounding 3 other people on Wednesday. So far, no attackers have been publicly identified. With Republicans seizing control of the U.S. Senate, President Barack Obama may face a different foreign policy landscape during his last 2 years in office. VOA State Department correspondent Scott Stearns explains.
Republican control of both houses of Congress would limit the president's room to maneuver on 2 of his biggest foreign policy goals, says American University professor Guy Ziv.
This will create much more difficulty for President Obama to make the kind of progress that he's wanted to see in both the Iranian negotiations, Iran's nuclear negotiations, and the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Both of those issues have regrettably been used over the years as a partisan football on Capitol Hill.
Talks on Iran's nuclear program are scheduled to end later this month, with international negotiators working to convince Iran to limit its atomic activities in exchange for easing some economic sanctions. Many Senate Republicans are wary of a deal that allows Tehran to continue enriching any uranium, but President Obama already has the authority to waive U.S. sanctions without congressional approval. Cato Institute analyst Justin Logan says that could change as Republicans move to more forcefully confront Iran.
There's some prospect that a large Republican wave and takeover of the Senate could raise the prospect of sanctions bills against Iran without that waiver authority. But that requires Congress to sort of take responsibility for the policy and leave its fingerprints on the policy. And historically, they've been very wary of doing that.
Republican Senator John McCain's led his party's criticism of the slow U.S. support for moderate rebels in Syria and may push for a more active military role, says Atlantic Council analyst Robert Manning.
I think on the security side, you're likely to see Senator McCain taking over the Armed Forces Committee in the Senate, and I think that may be contentious in terms of defense spending and some of our military activities in the Middle East and elsewhere.
While the U.S. has started a program to train and equip Syrian rebels, the issue is not likely to go away given the fight against Islamic State militants.
There's a program in place. It's not being conducted the way Senator McCain would like it to be conducted. So I think the change here might really be how the conversation goes, what sorts of hearings happen, and how Republicans in the Senate can affect sort of the press coverage, what's said about the president's policies.
State Department spokeswoman Jen Psaki says U.S. diplomats cooperate equally whomever controls Congress.
The State Department is nonpartisan building and one where we work with Democrats and Republicans, so we will continue to move forward with that in mind.
As for Secretary of State Kerry's tenure, there were press reports during this campaign quoting Obama administration sources criticizing his foreign policy pursuits being untethered from the president. Spokeswoman Psaki says the White House is making pretty clear he'll be here. Scott Stearns, VOA News at the State Department.
Recent discoveries of oil and gas in Kenya are creating new and exciting prospects for the East African nation. Here to tell us more about it is Africa 54's Zoe Liudaki. Zoe?
That's right, Leonard. Kenya is emerging as Africa's next major oil producer. But the country must undergo a series of profound changes to manage and regulate the sector.
The discovery of crude oil in 2012 has propelled Kenya into a frenzy of activity to create policies, legislation, regulations, and institutions for this emerging sector. The Kenyan civil society platform on oil and gas is attempting to manage change and make sure that everyone benefits. Recently, it launched in Washington, D.C., a report with recommendations about the development of Kenya's oil and gas resources.
We are the vehicle that bridges the hopes and aspirations of the community members who we work closely with, and then the government. So we sort of sit in the middle.
The Kenyan civil society was formed under the initiative of international organization Oxfam that is committed to fighting poverty and injustice.
The biggest challenge is sort of maximizing the benefits to the country. So like we speak about local content, we speak about looking at tax revenues. So that's the first challenge, ensuring that the country actually benefits. The second thing is managing expectations, because everyone now is seeing, when people see oil, they think about dollars. They see just sort of dollar signs and everyone's thinking, we'll be rich.
The report offers a master plan for the government to adopt. One of the first challenges is the mining legislation.
So the mining legislation, if we get it right, will then decide how much of the revenue from oil the national government gets, how much the county government will get, and how much the community gets.
Turkana County is underdeveloped, and it has been historically ignored up until now. Experts predict that Anglo-Irish Tullow Oil Corporation can produce 3,000 to 4,000 barrels of crude oil a day. So some believe that Turkana County might demand a larger percentage of the oil revenues. Presently, there are 23 oil companies exploring 44 licensed parcels, with commercial production scheduled to start in 2017. Things are moving very fast, maybe too rapidly.
We've seen an openness from the government to listen to our comments and to get feedback from civil society groups. I think the bottom line is that we're seeing that there's a sequencing problem with the development of policies and laws, and we're concerned that it becomes very difficult once the laws have gone through to then make amendments.
The Kenya Civil Society and Oxfam are working closely with the Federal Communications Commission in the United States to develop global disclosure requirements to regulate the flow of money. It is important to know what payments foreign companies have made to the Kenyan government, stresses the Kenyan Civil Society.
Our report insists that the government should have a national development plan of how these revenues will be used for poverty alleviation, in delivering basic services like health and education, because the areas where these funds are have never had government services before.
Oil experts estimate the production of 100,000 barrels of crude oil a day. The situation is in flux, but one thing appears to be certain, that Kenya is on the road to becoming a significant oil producer and exporter in sub-Saharan Africa.
Joining us today to talk about the Kenyan oil boom is Dan Gary, Senior Policy Manager of Oxfam America. Mr. Gary, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you for having me.
You have been following very closely the oil boom in Africa. You have written extensively about it. How is Kenya doing?
Well, I think it's very early days. As the report notes, the situation is still one of exploration. Tullow has not even declared that it's a commercial find yet, but the expectations are already high. As the segment notes, there's a lot of activity in terms of pieces of legislation, a lot of moving parts in terms of policies, and that's difficult for the government to manage, and it's also difficult for citizens and civil society groups to engage on these multiple processes. But at the same time, the Kenyan government has shown an openness and a willingness to engage with civil society groups like the Kenya Oil Platform, so that's very positive. I think there have been bumps along the road already. For example, there have been protests, localized protests in Turkana related to jobs and other issues. So it's important for the government and for the oil companies to get out in front of those issues and make sure that expectations are very well managed.
Let's talk a little bit about expectations. When people hear that the country has found oil or is exploring to find oil, people think everybody's going to get rich. So everybody expects that suddenly in my community there'll be jobs, there'll be money, I'll be set. What is the reality?
I think the reality is that in many countries around the world, those expectations are simply not met. The oil industry produces very few jobs. Many of those jobs are technical in nature, and what you see in Turkana is that many people simply don't have the skills to take advantage of the employment opportunities, and training programs might be put in place, but then the jobs disappear after a certain point in time. So the most important thing to actually get benefits for those populations is making sure that the money is managed well, is managed transparently, and that is spent on things that can actually visibly improve the lives of people. Turkana is already seen as somewhat outside of Kenya. It's the poorest part of the country. They don't feel connected to the national debates already. So making sure that money is properly invested in health and education. It has very low literacy rates in that part of Kenya. Those are the key challenges for the Kenyan government right now.
Which country is a success story in Africa? They have managed to have transparency. Country, I mean, that has had an oil boom, a recent oil boom. In your experience, which country comes closer to that?
Well, there are far more failures than success stories, but I think one qualified success so far is Ghana in West Africa. They discovered oil in 2007. Again, it was Tullow, the same company. they were able to put in place a very strong petroleum revenue management law that ensures quarterly disclosures of all the payments. They've published all of the oil agreements online so citizens can see exactly how much the government is getting and how much the companies are getting in terms of profits. And they've been able to direct spending to some priority areas such as agriculture. At the same time, Ghana is facing difficulties now. They've used oil as collateral to borrow heavily. Now they've had to go back to the IMF to get new support. So there are risks as well. And when you look at Kenya, you might see risks in those situations as well. Will Kenya start to borrow on its oil revenues? Will the state oil company become a power unto itself? These are the kinds of risks that we've seen in Nigeria and Angola and other places play out.
From your experience, what ingredients need to exist in a country for things to go well? So the oil sector is regulated in a good way and the community benefits.
Well, first is setting the framework and making sure that that framework is transparent, putting all the petroleum agreements into the public domain, making sure that the financial disclosures between companies and governments are open. Second is making sure that communities are engaged and consulted and give their consent to these projects when they go forward. I think another key issue is for the systems of expenditure to be carefully monitored. So you need to have active civil society, you need to have journalists who can do investigative reporting, and you need to have parliamentarians who take their oversight responsibilities very seriously.
Ian Gary, thank you so much for talking to us. Thank you for talking to Africa 54 about the oil boom in Kenya. Back to you, Leonard.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Well, we want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa 54, and check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Coming up, how a new genetic test is helping pinpoint rare childhood diseases. Stay with us.
I'm Milar Sega. I'm the host of VOA's The Correspondents, a roundup of the world's top stories with analysis from our dedicated reporters. It's really a conversation the same way that you would bring a friend to your home and ask them what's going on. And our correspondents will do that and answer those questions through their own eyes.
That appears a false choice in more ways than one.
We can't actually put you there, but we can come pretty close. In 30 minutes, we'll show you the world.
Welcome back. Most rare diseases are genetic and appear early in life. While a child may show symptoms, it's often difficult to confirm a diagnosis. As VOA's Rosen Skirball reports, a powerful new genetic test may reduce the uncertainty by providing more conclusive results earlier.
Going on the bear hunt. I'm not afraid.
Calvin Lapidus loves nursery school, but then again, his mother Audrey says he's a naturally happy kid.
And he's really easygoing, so he pretty much likes everything. Most of all, he loves people, he loves hugs, he loves his sister.
And big sister Sadie loves Calvin back, entertaining him to his delight. But at 3.5, Calvin can't walk or talk and is intellectually disabled. Although Audrey saw early signs that worried her, doctors said his development was normal.
But by 8 months, he hadn't started sitting up on his own, and he wasn't rolling over on his own, and he was just missing his milestones.
A frantic odyssey to discover what was wrong led the family to the Clinical Genomics Center at the University of California, Los Angeles. Calvin was screened with a new test called exome sequencing, an analysis of the entire genome at once instead of gene by gene. The team at the center extracted and sequenced DNA from blood samples from Calvin and his parents. Then they scanned all the genes simultaneously to find the single gene mutation, says Stanley Nelson, a UCLA professor of human genetics and pathology and laboratory medicine.
And on average, every location in the genome at the end of this process is oversampled 100 times. So what it means is that we see 50 of the DNA variants that you got from your mom. We see 50 of the DNA variants that you got from your dad at every single base position in the exome or in the protein coding part of the genome. So that makes it incredibly high quality.
Of the 5,000 rare genetic diseases considered, Calvin's symptoms match Pitt-Hopkins syndrome. Since that diagnosis, over 814 patients whose conditions had previously baffled doctors have been tested using the new protocol. Among the most complex cases like Calvin's, 40% received a definitive diagnosis compared to 5% just 20 years ago. Audrey Lapidus says while painful, knowing what Calvin's disorder is ended a period of uncertainty.
The diagnosis has certainly helped me prepare for the future as far as, knowing what to expect.
Calvin is among 500 known cases of Pitt-Hopkins. And since his diagnosis, his family has taken steps to help others, creating the Pitt-Hopkins Research Foundation, dedicated to finding a treatment and cure for the disease. Roseanne Skirbel, VOA News, Washington.
The United Nations says Iraq and Syria face a chronic shortage of aid funding despite the massive scale of the humanitarian crisis in the region. As VOA's Aisha Tanzim reports, the problem is expected to get even worse with the onset of winter.
Many of these men, women and children escaped with only the clothes on their backs. Now they're among the millions in Syria and Iraq who need humanitarian assistance. The United Nations is calling it the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world today. But Baroness Emma Nicholson of the international charity MR Foundation says donors are not responding to appeals for more aid funding.
For a reason I cannot understand, I cannot explain, the world has barely shifted in its response. The big funders haven't come across, yet there are 1.4 million new refugees, IDPs, inside Iraq alone. I do know what's going on in Syria, and this is spreading.
I think part of it is that there are so many emergencies right now.
Joel Charney of Interaction, an alliance of more than 180 non-governmental organizations, says donors may be facing difficult decisions on where to direct their money.
So some of it is competition or sort of donors trying to figure out, do we respond in Syria and Iraq? Do we respond in South Sudan? Do we respond in the Central African Republic? We now have the Ebola crisis.
Countries have donated large sums. U.S. aid to Iraq and Syria since 2012 has topped $1.5 billion. Saudi Arabia recently gave the UN $500 million. But Charney says it takes more than just money to alleviate the crisis.
Yes, if we had more aid, we could provide more services. But, let's face it, fundamentally, this is a crisis that can only be solved diplomatically. And the whole diplomatic process has ground to a halt.
Meanwhile, the UN is worried about the onset of winter, and humanitarian groups have been trying to find ways to raise empathy in the general public so people will donate more. So far, they say they have not succeeded. Aisha Tanzim, VOA News, Washington.
It's time now for a short break. Still to come on Africa 54. Queen Bee comes out on top again. We'll be right back.
If you've just joined us, I'm Mariama Diallo, and here is a quick recap of today's headlines.
Libya's Supreme Court rules that the country's internationally recognized parliament is unconstitutional, setting stage for more political unrest. In Burkina Faso, political parties agreed to a year-long transition with elections next November, but failed to elect a transitional leader. In Tanzania, environmental activist group reports that officials traveling with Chinese president went on a buying spree for illegal ivory. Finally, the United Nations investigating mass rape of women and girls in Darfur is denied access by the Sudanese government.
That's it for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Welcome back to Africa 54. Here is what's trending. How about a platinum record party of one? Backed by #1 hit Shake It Off and weeks of TV appearances, Taylor Swift sold over 1 million copies of her new album, 1989, in its first week of release. How about that? So far in 2014, only one album has sold more than 1 million copies, the soundtrack to the movie Frozen, which actually came out in 2013. So what's her secret? Taylor knows how to leverage social media, regularly engaging her 40 million plus Twitter followers. Taylor Swift is having a great year, but Queen Bee still reigns supreme. According to Forbes magazine, Beyoncé is the highest paid woman in music in 2014, with estimated earnings of $115 million, more than double what she pulled in last year. The huge sum, most of which was from her world tour, propelled Beyoncé from 4th place last year and put her firmly ahead of Taylor Swift with $64 million, who jumped up one spot from last year to #2. Pop singer Pink climbed up from #8 in 2013 to 3rd with $52 million. Also on the list were Rihanna, Katy Perry, and Lady Gaga. And finally, that sound you're hearing is heartbreaking all over the world. Sherlock star Benedict Cumberbatch has announced his engagement to theater director Sophie Hunter in a very old-school way with a tiny announcement in the Times newspaper in London. Hunter is known for avant-garde plays and studied theater in Paris and New York. The news of a Cumberbatch wedding is a tough pill to swallow for some admirers, as his star rose with roles in 12 Years a Slave, Star Trek in Darkness, and of course Sherlock. The charming actor has become an international heartthrob. And that's what's trending today. That's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. For more news, tune in to VOA's evening radio show, Africa News Tonight, at 1800 UTC, and in the mornings to Daybreak Africa, between 300 and 600 UTC, Monday to Friday. Thanks for watching, and good night from Washington.
Welcome to the Voice of America's News Words. This word has to do with health care in the United States.
John Boehner, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, does not like President Barack Obama's health care reforms.
Why did the president mislead the American people when he promised they could keep their health care plan? Why is Obamacare forcing Americans to lose access to the doctors they like?
The Affordable Care Act, often called Obamacare, is the president's program to provide health care for Americans.
Despite early problems with the program's website, the White House hopes that many Americans will use Obamacare to get health care.
Now, when you hear the word Obamacare, you will know what this news word means.